All right, so my name is Jonathan Petit-Frere. I'm a senior software engineer at Netflix, and I'll be talking about building modern responsive widgets with Jetpack Glance. And I'll basically be showing you an example of how to actually use Jetpack Glance. And full disclosure, everything I'll show you today is basically something I created for this presentation. It's not necessarily anything that Netflix is actually building today. So with a raise of hands, how many people know what widgets are? How many people know what Jetpack Compose is? And how many people know what Jetpack Glance is? All right, nice. So for the folks that didn't raise their hand to the first question, what is a widget? Gemini actually helped me with this, but widgets are miniature interactive views on a home or lock screen that give users quick access or information and functionality from their apps without needing to open them fully. And Jetpack Glance is a framework that's actually built on top of Jetpack Compose, specifically designed for creating app widgets using the same declarative UI approach. It simplifies app widget development, offering like a set of composables like columns and rows that we're basically used to when using Jetpack Compose. So what's the difference between Jetpack Compose and Jetpack Glance? They both actually share like a similar declarative UI. They use composable functions to build components. Compose is meant for building full Android apps. Glance is used to build app widgets. There should be an asterisk on there, and you'll know a little bit more about it later. Compose renders directly on the actual device within the actual app. Glance actually uses remote views under the hood for remote rendering. Compose cannot be used for building app widgets. Glance is limited to the same set of rules that remote views actually have. So you can't necessarily scroll horizontally, you can only scroll vertically. That's just a limitation that it has. So you can only use like a lazy column, but not necessarily a lazy row. So to give you an idea of what we're actually building, this is a screenshot of the actual widget that I'm gonna just go step by step on how to actually build. It's a popular movies app widget. It uses the movie database API to basically get the current week's popular movies. And I'll basically be going step by step on how to do it. So it's a pretty simple widget for the most part. It has a box art image, it has a title, it has an overview. And you can of course scroll vertically to see like whatever the rest of the popular movies are for the week. So the first thing you'll basically have to do is add your dependencies. They're pretty straightforward. There's about 4 that you kind of need. One of them is kind of optional, the Material 3 one. It depends on like what is your design language, what are you kind of going for. So you may or may not use that, but the rest are pretty much required. Then we'll basically start off with a popular movies app widget, which extends the Glance app widget class. Then we'll actually have to override the size mode. The size mode only has 3 possible values. So single is essentially the default mode. Single is essentially it'll be a fixed size. You should only use it when you only have a fixed size, and the content does not change if you actually like resize it. So it's pretty straightforward. Responsive is the next one. This is when you actually define a set of different sizes that you actually want your actual widgets to actually be. And the one that we're actually going to use today is exact. And this is basically similar to using match parent in XML or fill max view in Jetpack Compose. So the next thing we have to do is actually override the provide glance function. And then from there, I'm actually using HILT to actually get the movie database repository to actually get the popular movies. If you're not actually using like a repository pattern like I am using here, you can use like the glance state definition class to persist any information that you actually want to show in the actual widget. So we're going to use the provide content function to basically build our UI, and then from there, all of our composes will essentially go in there. So we'll add the glance theme, and inside the glance theme, we'll add a lazy column. And from there, it takes a list of items, which is the popular movies. And then from there, we have the movie card composable, and then we pass in each movie from there. We'll come back to it, but I want to get into the only parameter that the Glance app widget actually has is the error UI layout. And this is essentially the fallback to if anything happens during like the composition. Essentially, this is your fallback. If it's a non-static layout that you actually want to actually use, you'll actually have to override the on composition error function, and then from there you basically have to treat it like a regular remote view at that point, because at this point it's just a fallback. So you'll basically create a remote view like you normally would, given a package name and whatever the actual layout that you're actually gonna use, and then from there you can use like the regular set of functions that you normally use when working with remote views. So in this case, I'm setting the text view text to error has occurred, and obviously this may change depending on like what your design is and what you're kind of going for. But and then from there, you just basically have to just make sure you call update app widget, and that'll make sure that the actual widget is actually updated properly. But in this use case, I'm not going to actually go with a custom implementation of it. I'm just going to use the default implementation of it, and it looks a little something like this. It just says can't show content, which is good enough, at least for me in this use case. So now that we have our Glance app widget built, we're going to move on to creating a popular movies app widget receiver, and that actually extends the Glance app widget receiver class. And just like any other receiver, you actually for this one you actually have to override just one field for the most part, which is the Glance app widget field, and from there you can actually just set it to the app widget class that we actually created earlier. So in this case, it's the popular movies app widget. So just like any other receiver, we actually have to add it to our manifest, and from there it's pretty straightforward. You just set the name to whatever the name of your receiver is, and in our case it's the popular movies app widget receiver. Then we add an intent filter with the action app widget update, and from there this may look familiar if you built widgets before. So this is like one of the things that still remains the same when using Jetpack Glance. You still actually have to give it the metadata, the same kind of info that you were given before. So the and I'll get a little bit more into that. So the metadata XML file has the app widget provided at the root of it, and then from there you can set like what you want your initial layout to actually look like. This layout is actually given to you with the actual Glance dependency, so it's a pretty good one for the most part. It looks something like this. It's literally just a white background with progress spinner that's always just going to keep spinning. And from there you can set your minimum width and height as well. If you want to set a maximum width and height, you actually have to create another XML file that only targets API level 31 and higher. And from there you can also set your resize mode. In my case, we're going to be able to basically resize it horizontally and also vertically. And if you wanted to, I guess, periodically update your widget automatically, you can also use like the update period millisecond attribute also, but in my case I'm actually not using it. So now that we actually have everything kind of implemented already, the widget actually looks something like this. So you can notice how the box art image actually gets bigger when the widget is actually at its minimum size. But obviously when the width actually gets a little bit larger, it gets a little bit smaller to make space for the title and actual overview. And you're probably wondering, how is that possible? Let's actually take a look at our movie card composable that we talked about earlier. So from there, a lot of this probably looks a little bit familiar, but from there, basically using a column from there, and it's taking up the max space that it could potentially take. And notice how I'm actually using a Glance modifier instead of just a regular modifier. Whenever you're using like Glance composables, you have to use the Glance modifier as the actual modifier, or I'm pretty sure it won't compile. And even if it does, you'll probably run into a composition error, and you'll probably end up seeing the fallback error state that I showed you earlier. And then from there, you can just check if the width is, in my case, it's just larger than 200 density pixels, then we should show the large movie card. If not, then we should show the small one. So the large movie card actually includes the title and overview in it. The small movie card is just the box image. And if your size mode was actually responsive, it would actually look something like this, where the size.width is actually you just need to check if it's actually greater than one of your companion objects. So in my case, it's a small square width. And I also just added a spacer at the end, just so that I just have a little bit of space in between each movie card. So going into the image composable within the movie card a little bit more, you can actually use the Glance modifier's clickable function to dictate basically what happens when you actually tap on it. So in my case, I'm actually just starting the main activity, which is basically opening up the main part of the actual app itself. This can include parameters if you need extra parameters, if you want to log something based off of like where the actual user is coming from, and kind of just get a better understanding of that. There's other functions available, not just for activities. You can use action send broadcast for broadcast receivers, action start service for any kind of service. So background services and foreground services. I think foreground services, you still need to include an extra parameter, basically dictating that it's a foreground service. And if that isn't enough for you, you can also extend action callback class, and you can basically pass in that class into the action run callback function. And for long running tasks that to kind of just avoid ANRs, you should actually use Work Manager for those. So as of Android Studio Koala feature drop, which I believe was released maybe in like the last couple weeks, we actually have the ability to actually preview what our composer would actually look like without actually having to compile everything. So this is an example of what the smaller card essentially looks like. So since the width is actually less than 200, this is essentially what we see. The red box is basically a representation of what the image actually should be. Since it's a preview, I don't necessarily have a placeholder for it since it's loading images. So for now, I just basically put a red box. And for the case that we're actually, the width is actually larger than 200 density pixels, it'll basically look like this. So you can kind of just mix and match kind of however you kind of want to kind of get a better idea of like how your widget would basically look in different sizes at that point. Okay, so now that our widget is essentially built and we have a preview, how do we actually get users to actually use it? I feel like one of the biggest problems with widgets is just discoverability of it. Most of the times, if you have to actually go through the OS to kind of figure out like what widgets are available with what apps, but there is an easy way, at least within the actual app, where you can actually prompt folks to kind of just like use your widgets. So the first thing we actually have to do is get our app widget manager using the given context wherever you're doing it. In my case, this is actually within like a button on click handler. So as long as you pass in the context and obviously set the provider, all you have to do is actually check if the is request pin app widget supported. And if it is, this is actually success callback. This isn't necessarily doing anything to be honest, but if you wanted to like log something just to make sure that you have a signal when folks actually successfully pin your widget, you can update this pending intent for whatever your use case essentially is. But this essentially does what we're kind of looking for, basically calling app widget manager request pinned app widget, passing the provider and the success callback. You can pass in null if you don't need a success callback, but it will look basically something like this when it actually runs. So this screen might vary depending on like the launcher, because it's essentially up to the launchers and manufacturers at this point to kind of just like being able to actually support this, which is why we actually have to check if it's actually supported before we actually call this request method. But this is just on an emulator. It's pretty straightforward for the most part. It kind of just prompts you to pin it. You can hit add and it'll automatically add it to your home screen, or you can actually press and hold and pin it and put it kind of anywhere that you actually want to. So earlier I kind of talked about how Glance is only used for app widgets. That was a little bit of a lie, because you can also use it to actually make Wear OS tiles. So to do that, you'll actually use this Gradle dependency, and it's actually pretty straightforward from there. You can actually use so in this case, I have the main tile service, actually extend the Glance tile service at this point. And from there, we just have to override the content function and annotate it with both composable and Glance composable. And from there, we can actually use basically everything we kind of talked about earlier to actually make whatever layout you're kind of looking for. This is a really like bare bones case of it, of just like putting a box. I didn't include the rest of it because it's too much code, but you can put a column in there and add text. You can add buttons. You can add buttons to it to build your layout to whatever your design is at that point. And since obviously it's a service, we still have to actually add this service to our Android manifest with the permission bind tile provider. And we also actually have to include intent filter with the action bind tile provider as well. And of course, some metadata also. In this case, this is just for the preview. This is what users will actually see on their phone if they're actually trying to customize their Wear OS device. So in my case, I'm just showing the actual launcher icon for the actual app, and which I think is just like a generic one. So just to kind of give you an idea what it actually looks like, it looks a little something like this. And this is actually a demo of an app that I made. I'll actually have a link for this app actually at the end. And it's just a simple quote app. It's literally just a column. There's 2 text fields with the title, with whatever the quote is, and then whoever the actual author is. And I think it refreshes every 24 hours using Work Manager. Okay, so quick recap. Jetpack Glance can be used to build responsive widgets and Aware OS styles. Function names are the same as Jetpack Compose components, but the package names are different. So for instance, for Box, it's AndroidX.glance.layout.box versus AndroidX Compose Foundation.layout.box. I'm 100% sure it'll still compile if you end up using the Compose version, but it'll most likely just throw an error once it actually tries to render, and it'll show you whatever your fallback error layout is at the time. And make sure you actually use the glance modifier instead of the actual just regular modifier, because we're dealing with glance components and not necessarily Jetpack Compose components. And there's some things that I couldn't necessarily get to in this, but I wanted to actually still kind of call out. So you should use Work Manager for long-running tasks, and then from there you can just update the widget whenever the data is available, or your image finished loading, or whatever the case may be. Glance actually still supports remote view, so there's some cases where you might still have a mix of using Glance and still might be building some UI still in XML. So to do that, you can use the Android remote views composable, and then from there you can just pass in the package name and the layout, and you can honestly use it as a container if you want to, depending on like what the actual root of the remote view is. Like if it's like a frame layout or linear layout, you can always use that. You still have to specify it, but it is possible. And you actually can unit test glance composables as well, which I didn't necessarily get to, which is a lot easier than like trying to run UI tests for the most part, but it's pretty straightforward. You usually have to specify what you want the width and the height of your widget to actually be, and you can just verify like all the components that you expect is actually there, along with the actual values of it. All right, so thank you so much. These are some resources I found honestly like really helpful while building this. Hope this inspires everybody and can serve as like a really good starting point on like how to build responsive widgets and Wear OS tiles. Happy building, have a great day, and definitely feel free to ask me any questions after the session for sure.